So the planned project for this week is not quite done yet, so unfortunately I don't have the project video for it. Instead, I thought I'd take a bit of a closer look at power carving and the power carving tools that I use. Before we get started, however, I have had quite a few questions about the workbench which featured in a video last week, and whether this was a teaser, when the series is coming out on it, that sort of thing. It turns out I've already put the series out, I just hadn't released the artsy edit of it. For me, being alone in this workshop all by myself is often easy for me to forget that not everybody's been with me from the beginning and watching all of my videos. So last year I did a series on building my workbench. It's not 100% complete because I haven't finished building the workbench, but everything up until the leg vise, which is the only thing I've got left, is in video format. So I'll have links to that in the description below, or the little eye thing, whichever corner that appears in. And yeah, that's from last year, so hopefully people get value out of that. In the tea tray video last weekend, I used two power carving tools. The majority of the work was done with this Arbortech turbo plane, which attaches to an angle grinder, and the texturing was done with a dremel. I'll have a look at the angle grinder stuff first because it's kind of cool. So there are a bunch of angle grinder based power carving tools, and as far as I'm aware, all of them use a 4 or 4.5 inch grinder. This is a relatively inexpensive, about $100 DeWalt grinder. I like this one because it's relatively narrow, so you can get a good grip on it, and the switch is on the back rather than a sliding lock switch on the side, which can clog with sawdust. But any standard angle grinder that's 4 or 4.5 inch will do. So there are a bunch of power carving tools that you can use. There are sanding discs, really coarse grits, 40 grit, that sort of thing. They're going to be slow. They are sanders at the end of the day. They're fast compared to sanding by hand or with an orbital sander, but they're still slow for carving. The next step up from that are carbide burrs. I don't have one of those. I eventually will probably get one, and a company called Cutsall makes those. There's probably other brands, but Cutsall is the most well known. They're basically a spiky disc coated in a carbide film, and they act a lot like a sanding disc. They don't have a real aggressive tooth on them as such, but more this burr, spiky sanding sort of action. They're much faster than sandpaper, as it is more aggressive than sandpaper, but it's not as aggressive as some of the other tools. So it lets you really blend corners easily. They're fast compared to sandpaper, but not as fast compared to a lot of bladed type carving tools that remove more material per pass. But you do trade off control, basically. The next step up in speed and control is probably this turbo plane. So this is by Arbortech, Australian company based out of WA. And this is not their only carving tool, but probably the one that you want to get if you're getting into power carving. What's neat about this is it's got 3 cutters, carbide cutters, but there's no cutting edge on the sides. So you would have seen with the tea tray that I followed a template, and that's because there's no cutters on the side, so I can safely follow a template, make my pattern, remove the template, use the existing edges as the template, and keep going down and down and down. It also makes it a lot safer, but there are some cuts you can't do with it. Obviously, with no cutting edges on the side, you can't do a plunge cut on the side. So you tend to work more on the face of it. So this isn't anything, it's just a carving, it's test carving to show roughly what it can do. I was sort of working at spirals. I'm not a carver, at least not yet. It's not something I'm used to. I don't really think in sculptural terms in terms of how to actually approach a shape, but you can definitely see that this removes material fast and pretty smooth. And I mean, it's going to probably look all like sawdust on camera, but these are definite shavings here rather than just dust. And for context, this is some red gum. If you're not in Australia and don't know what red gum is, it's very hard. So onto texture power carving, and I'll show you how I did this. For the texturing on the bottom of the tea tray, I used a simple dremel. You could use any brand rotary tool, but Dremel happens to be what I've got, and most people will know what I'm talking about if I say Dremel rather than rotary tool. This is the model 398. I have no idea what that means. It's a plug-in one with variable speed at the back. I don't think it actually matters too much what brand you've got. The important thing is this fixed base, sort of like a router, and the bit that you've actually got in there. So this style of texture is probably most popularized by Kyle Toth. It wasn't actually the look I was going for, but as I started putting it on, I really quite liked it and went with it. I was after more of a hammered type finish, but with my skill level, that didn't end up happening, but it worked out great anyway. What do you really need? As I said, this fixed base guide, I've got this maybe protruding 1 millimeter at most. You really want just a tiny amount, and that's why a Dremel works. If you're removing a lot of material, you'd run into issues. As for the bit, I happen to be using a ball nose spiral fluted bit. This is often used on CNCs and that sort of thing because it leaves a really nice smooth finish. Another option would be a fishtail bit or a spiral down cut. You could get away with a spiral upcut, but that will pull the fibers up and leave you with a surface that you'll definitely need to sand. And if you're going for the paint first, then carving, that can be problematic. So you'd be better off with a down cut bit, which will tend not to pull the fibers up. Now, I don't really want to use the paint or the stain I used on the tea tray for a demo. So I've got a piece of plywood here. This is some birch ply with a phenolic resin coating on top, which is the bright red. On the tea tray, you might have noticed that I had a few straight lines, and we can simulate that with a piece of tape. One of the really nice things about this technique is that it is quite easy to do. There's quite little torque from the Dremel, so it's quite easy to control. So I'm going to do it in these two areas and not in this large one. I'll have some nice straight lines. So does that style of carving work okay with a trim router? And the answer is yes. If we look at the sample here, there are some pros and cons to using each type of device, but it does also matter what type of cutter you've got in it. On the Dremel, I've got a ball end mill, so there are portions that aren't sculpted out. So what you end up getting is sort of a roughish looking texture. Now that might be what you're after, and that is fine, there's nothing wrong with that, it's just a different look. When I use the flat straight end bit in the trim router, it's perfectly flat. But the downside to this particular bit is that it's relatively speaking quite wide, so you get less definition in the corners. You can't get quite as narrow. The V bit that I used, this guy here, is very similar to the ball gouge, I don't know why I keep calling it ball gouge, the ball end mill, in that you still get ridges, though this one you get even more detail. You can control how much detail you want by how deep the bit is, and of course you can get different angle V-bits. So this is, I think, like a 60-degree one, so you can get much narrower ones that would allow you to go deeper, much wider ones that wouldn't necessarily allow as much detail. So if you're power carving, which one should you go for? It really depends is the answer. Trim router is going to be quieter. There is next to no difference between the load and no load sounds because you're only going at most 1 millimeter down. The Dremel is partially the cutter, it's partially the tool, but it's much louder when you're actually cutting, so there's that ergonomic part coming into it. Speaking of ergonomics, the barrel on a trim router is much wider, and also the base is much larger, so it's a bit more of a stretch of your hand, whereas with a Dremel it's more pen-like, so it's a bit less fatiguing. However, that could be solved with a offset base with a handle. Much of a muchness there. The trim router's weight distribution is a little bit better than the Dremel, so you've got to work less to keep it upright, so a bit less fatiguing there. So there's no real clear winner if you're just doing flat pieces. Where it gets a little bit more complicated is when you've got curves. So on the T-tray, it was curved in multiple directions, and that's where it gets a little bit more complicated. On the flat section, the trim router would have been just fine, except I wouldn't have been able to get quite as close up against the legs with this size trim router base. Maybe I should have done it before putting the legs on, but that's a different matter entirely. With the compound curves, having a smaller base lets you balance it a bit easier, whereas if you're on a larger base, it is going to affect what size curve you can get into in what direction. So the answer is there's no real clear winner, it just depends on what you're doing. For a lot of us woodworkers that build furniture, straight lines are what we're all about because we've got all the tools for making straight lines. As I'm developing my skills further, I'm finding a lot of enjoyment in introducing curves and compound curves, carved shapes. So this is likely something I will get into more. Not necessarily this texture or this shape, but combinations of power carving textures, power carving curves, using the bandsaw to create nice arcs and curves and that sort of stuff. I find it a really good challenge. It's quite an expressive field, but really doesn't come naturally to me, so it's still quite a lot of work. So there'll be lots of experimentation in the future, I'm sure. In the coming weeks, I hope to have a look at Arbortech's new tool, the ball gouge, but we'll see how we go with that. Hopefully this will maybe demystify how some of these things are done and how achievable they are, and you have a shot at doing them yourself. Thanks for watching.